Hey, it's the Czar. Today, we're going on a journey. Let me be your shaman on this shamanistic voyage. Today, we're going to talk about horror games, okay? We need to talk about where they came from, why they're important, and where they're going to go, okay? We're going to have to use our imagination a little bit. You are, at least, because I don't have one of those, and also, you need to do the work. You're the one who clicked on the video, so, it's my world, and you're just living in it. The year is 1972. The Magnavox Odyssey is at peak performance and, as such, was capable of displaying 3 entire dots at one time and costed $620.
Oh my god!
To make up for that, you get a few games free, I guess. There were a lot of games that came with the cards on this console, but there's only one we need to talk about today because the rest of them are like tennis and torpedo hunt or whatever, but this is wholly original. It's called Haunted House, and it comes from the 4th card. Its gameplay was rather simple, and it just had 2 players battling each other, where one was a spooky ghost and the other was a generic white guy wandering into a haunted house that was, haunted. White people love to do that, I guess. Additionally, in order to play this game, you had to put like a plastic little dingle-dongle onto your screen and use real-life playing cards to track the score.
No, you scared me.
This is next-generation immersion. I'd be willing to say most people think this game aged like milk from an ass, but it still counts as the first game that purposefully tried to elicit fear, I guess, and therefore could be considered the first horror game. It was also one of the only games on the console that was not just a digital translation of a real-life game. You could go outside and play handball with your pal Kenny, or you could play it on the Magnavox with 2 dots. And real-life playing cards again for some reason. On March 10th, 1980, Space Invaders came out in the good old US of A and made $13 billion in revenue. Yes, that's billion with a B is in ballin' because it quickly acquired the title of the highest grossing video game of all time for 2 entire years until Pac-Man dethroned it. Space Invaders was one of the very few games in the years after Haunted House that would attempt to have some sort of theme or aesthetic that determined its gameplay, rather than the gameplay defining the setting like most other arcade games at the time. And you might be asking me, what in the absolute butt does Space Invaders have to do with the history of horror games? And I have a single number for you, with multiple zeros on it. $13 billion. Can you fathom how much money that is? That is more money than anyone, and I mean nearly anyone, will see. This was the most success a video game had ever had, and for sure, that's going to influence the games to come, because there's going to be copycats. And while knockoffs and terrible recreations of other video games are not necessarily the best for video games, this did increase the amount of interest people had in scarier aesthetics and just places that they weren't exactly comfortable being. Gamers wanted to game in more uncomfortable situations. And just 1 year later, there would be another hit. Hit is kind of an overstatement. Most people don't even know this game exists. If you didn't think Haunted House was the first horror game, this is the first horror game. Let me introduce to you 3D Monster Maze. Look at this game. I don't know why, but this little dinosaur makes me so uncomfortable. It makes me want to turn my white pants into yellow. It makes me want to die. It just makes me so violently uncomfortable. And a lot of people seem to share that sentiment because this game was sort of a micro cult classic hit. There isn't really much to talk about in terms of gameplay because the title kind of says it all. It's in 3D. There's a dinosaur chasing you, and you have to make it to the end of the maze, and that's literally the whole game, that's it. But regardless, this is the first game that could ever truly be a horror game, I feel, and not just sort of unintentionally anxiety-provoking. Over the years from 1972 all the way to 1992, the number of dots we could put on screen would go from 3 to more than 3, and developers were really starting to take advantage of advanced graphical capabilities to make you real uncomfortable. It started out in kind of a silly manner with more slapstick horror like Castlevania, Ghosts and Goblins, Maniac Mansion. They're all taking note of the earlier kind of scary but not really all that scary themes of Space Invaders and taking it in a new direction. But none of these games were actually horrifying. I mean, we had 3D Monster Maze, but no one's thinking about 3D Monster Maze when they wake up the next day. It wasn't possible to make a game that was truly scary, that would stick with you for days on end, right? On March 22nd, 1996, Resident Evil would be released for the PlayStation and forever raised the bar for quality in horror games. Resident Evil showed up and said, "You better get that goo goo gaga wah wah shit out of here because I'm gonna show you the definition of a smash hit." It sold 4 million copies in its first year in circulation, and it was horrifying. It was the peak of graphics, the peak of voice acting.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
And the peak of music. This game also aged like wet cheese, but it was such a step up for the time. Look at the difference between the 3 dots and the more than 3 dots. It's ridiculous. Of course people were gonna love this. This game was terrifying, like truly terrifying. You had this janky-ass camera that would constantly make it feel like you never had as much control as you wanted. Zombies were legitimate and terrifying threats. You have very limited supplies in this game, and if you get cornered, those monsters are going to eat through your supplies. They're going to eat through your supplies like a Jersey Mike's sub. You've got nothing. There's a real possibility you won't even have enough ammo to fight the bosses in this game, and you'll just have to reset to a previous save. Talk about really scary. By the early 2000s, horror games had officially cemented themselves as a genre to be reckoned with. They were fully AAA, staple horror franchises were wonderful, and then they were not so wonderful, and then some of them were wonderful again, and then some of them were not so wonderful again. But despite the sad nature of watching these titanic franchises slip in their showers and wind up in nursing homes over and over again, this wasn't a particularly new feeling for people who played games. Lots of franchises had come and gone in the 90s, but there was something different this time. Now, there's a way to put the power to make your own versions of your favorite games in your own hands, and that thing was the internet. And also, code-savvy Scandinavian men. Indie games have entered the scene, and let me tell you, if you thought shit was crazy before, you have no idea what's coming next. Along with the rise of the internet came YouTube, and wanting to put YouTubers through the most torturous experience possible, and therefore we have horror Let's Plays. Early on it was games like Slenderman and the 8 Pages, Amnesia, Corpse Party, but as time progressed, independently developed games started to pick up the slack where AAA games seemed to be lacking. As internet users, we've had the pleasure of watching the internet work through its obsession with these new games as soon as they come out. As time has passed, we've come to the modern era, and new AAA inspirations in the horror scene have become fewer and farther between. The independent scene has exploded, so much that the games that were formerly staples of independent games are now AAA franchises in themselves. Just look at games like The Forest, Funny Bear Dad game, and Amogus. Over the last couple of years, the independent horror community has taken an interest in going back to its roots. It's hard to go any length of time on any game hosting website like itch.io or Steam or whatever without seeing a PS1 style horror game or just something that emulates a retro style. And I think that's just amazing. There's never been a better example of history influencing the present, quite like the indie horror scene. The history of horror games is such a rich and constantly evolving thing, and despite this being the end of the video for now, I have a very, very strong feeling I'm going to need to make a part 2. To conclude, thank you for your time, and thank you even more for watching. I hope you like this, because I really, really want to talk about scary things more. See you.